Who do you think is flying kites on the Gaza border in the middle of a war with strings that are kilometers long, when there has been a track record of kites being used as weapons?
Jerusalem Post answered the question, and the IDF mentioned it as well. 12 and 13-year-olds led by Hamas.
Yeah, Israel is once again murdering children and destroying places of worship, bombing tent housing, all under the very important pretense of we must murder the children flying kites and balloons.
But Cenk, these kites have strings that's all kilometers long, okay?
Yeah,
I mean, the strings are so dangerous for the Israelis, who are armed with 2,000-pound bombs. So what are they gonna do?
And she's gonna give you the whole story, but guys, as she's giving you the story, think about this, right? They say that the Israelis are doing self-defense. They're the victims. What if the Palestinians have kites and balloons? Meanwhile, they've dropped the equivalent of 13 atomic bombs on Gaza.
Yes, yes.
And our press tells you the children's balloons and kites are more dangerous than all the 2,000-pound bombs that Israel dropped, that Israel is the victim and the kids they're murdering are the terrorists that need to be destroyed so that the democracy of Israel can flourish.
They got them long strings, what can I say? Okay, so I want you guys to understand something that I myself didn't know until fairly recently. So Zionists look at the victims of the Holocaust, believe it or not, as weak, okay? As weak Jews, as they would describe them. And in fact, the whole notion of Zionism is to perpetuate this idea of the muscular Jew, okay? How are you gonna perpetuate that idea when you are literally pointing to children's homemade kites as something that you're afraid of and must drop bombs on children in Gaza over? Okay, so with that in mind, let's get to the details. So children in war-torn Gaza have somehow managed to demonstrate their resilience. You're looking at that resilience right now. They're still finding a way to be children, to play. They're literally sliding on these like steel beams that came from buildings that were bombed by the Israelis. One of the other things that they're doing is they're making their own kites. I don't even know how they find the materials to do it, but they do. And flying kites is how they, in my opinion, are showing their resilience, right? Because imagine living under the conditions they're living in and they're still able to find joy in life. And I think that's the reason why the Israelis are so furious. So as they're flying their kites, sometimes they lose control and the kite flies onto Israeli territory, falls on the ground. And some Israelis are like, this is unacceptable. We are afraid for our lives. I'm not kidding. So they complained to the government, and here's what happened. So Israel issues a warning. On Sunday, Benjamin Netanyahu and Defense Minister Israel Katz released a statement on X saying that they held a situational assessment regarding the threat of drones. Really?
There are no drones.
Drones? Hamas hasn't used drones. What drones are you talking about? Okay, drones, balloons and kites. Balloons and kites, okay. Israel warns Hamas that if the launches toward Israel do not cease immediately, and by the way, Hamas isn't launching kites. They're literally children launching the kite. Let me give you a statement. Let's go to graphic 1. This is a 13-year-old by the name of Omar. He spoke to the CBC and said this of flying kites. We fly kites so we can change our moods. There's nothing left in Gaza to make us happy.
And that's what's actually bothering the Israelis. They're like, oh, there's still a happy Palestinian. We haven't done our job of brutalizing them enough. That's what a fascist country does. I'll get back to that.
So according to the Times of Israel, a total of 12 kites and 4 balloons have reportedly crossed over into Israel from Gaza during the month of August. Not a single one of those balloons, not a single one of those kites had any type of incendiary device, had no weapon, nothing. They're literally just homemade kites and balloons. Okay. Nonetheless, there you go. Here's a perfect example. Here's a picture of what the Israelis are so terrified over, allegedly. And then the Times of Israel even reported on this and said at least 4 kites were flown from Gaza to Kibbutz Nahal Oz over the weekend. The army said nothing suspicious was found on the kites and there was no danger to the public. However, the Israelis are claiming that Hamas is directing the children to fly the kites into Israeli territory.
Oh.
These people are animals, okay? They're so disgusting, but it gets even worse. So the IDF has upped the stakes here because now a kite will be treated the same as a drone. If you don't believe me, here's what Israel Katz said in a separate statement. I report the news for a living, and one thing I never want to do is let one media outlet decide for me what the story is or which part of it matters. That's one of the reasons why I use Ground News. It's a website and app that brings reporting from across the political spectrum together in one place, but let me actually show you what that means. I can open basically any story and immediately see the bias distribution of the coverage. I can compare how outlets are writing their headlines, check the factuality ratings of the sources, and even see who owns them. So instead of just reading a headline and moving on, I have context about where that information is coming from and how differently the same story is being presented. But one of my favorite features is the blind spot feed. It specifically surfaces stories that one side of the political spectrum is barely even covering at all, which is incredibly useful if you're trying to get outside of your own media bubble. And you can create custom feeds around the topics you actually care about, so you can personalize what you follow and want to see more of. That's why I genuinely love Ground News. It gives me more control over how I consume the media, and I think that's something all of us could use right now. Go to ground.news/TYT or just scan the QR code to get 40% off the Vantage plan. That's the same plan we use. That's ground.news/TYT. A balloon is treated like a kite, and a kite is treated like a drone, with or without explosives. And he basically announced that to justify what they're calling targeted strikes in Gaza in response to literal children's homemade kites falling onto Israel's territory.
I guarantee you there will be supporters of Israel in this country. I guarantee you, I already know, I've seen it on social media, where they say, yeah, the children deserve to be murdered for flying kites.
Well, they're scum, they're scumbags.
But that's because they're in a fascist cult called Zionism. So I want to go back to that and explain something that's important. Are there different kinds of Zionists? Of course. Are there people who think Zionism just means, hey, I don't want people in Israel to die, I want it to be a safe haven for Jews? Of course there are. There are lots and lots of them, especially here in America, okay? Are there other Zionists who are radical Zionists who believe in fascism? Yes. Now the problem is that the other Zionists are like, oh, that's just all conspiracy theories. There's no way, we're all pure and innocent. Brother, just because you think one thing doesn't mean that someone else in that group thinks the same thing. They could think something very, very different, and you could see it in their actions. So Zionism is a form of nationalism. There's no question about that. It has nothing to do with religion. It is not Judaism. In fact, I would argue that in a lot of ways it's the opposite of Judaism. It is a nationalist project and it is toxic. And toxic nationalism, there's another word for it, it's fascism. And so you remember Zionism came up before the Holocaust. So it was well before the Holocaust the Zionist idea came, and in fact they started pushing for it. The Balfour Declaration is decades before World War II. So, but at that time, the reason why fascism rose in Germany was fascism, unfortunately back then, was a popular idea across the globe. And so different countries and groups thought we are the superior race and we should have our own nation, etc. Now, Jewish people had a good reason. They'd already suffered, even before the Holocaust, pogroms, etc. So I understand why people have a natural inclination to, well, I mean, they should have a safe haven. But the problem with Zionism, as almost everyone but the Zionists know, is that, yes, but the slogan was a people without a land for a land without a people. But there were people there, there were millions of Palestinians there. So by the very nature of Zionism, they had to move those people off that land.
Or kill them.
And now when you start out as a toxic nationalist project to begin with, saying, again, the great majority of Jewish people, especially in America, do not believe that they're the chosen people, chosen race, etc. But in Israel, they literally say, God promised us 3,000 years ago that we would get to own this land.
We are supreme.
So, and God told us we are the chosen people, the chosen race. The Germans also thought they were the chosen race. In their belt buckles for their soldiers, the Germans wrote, Gott mit uns. It means God is with us. And so the Zionists also believe the radical Zionists do with all their hearts, that God is with them. Gott mit uns. And so they now think, well, we got to move these people off that land. And they had to do it in 48. I know it breaks the hearts of like regular Zionists that don't know what actually happened. And they got brainwashed into, oh, the Palestinians went for a picnic. The Arabs attacked us out of nowhere. No, Jews had 6% of the land. And then they said, okay, now after this, the UN declares that we now have 55% of the land. They drove the Palestinians from that land. They were not attacked first. The Zionists attacked. Irgun, Haganah gang, etc. A bunch of literal terrorist groups killing civilians throughout that region, then started killing Palestinians and drove 750,000 of them off that land. Zionism required ethnic cleansing. They did it in 48, they did it in 67, and they're doing it now. So that is why, although it might break the hearts of Zionists that don't know any of this and that aren't part of that plan, there are radical Zionists who are definitely fascist. That is what leads to this kind of monstrosity at this point, where they're murdering kids for flying kites. That's not normal. That's late stage fascism. They've squeezed over 2 million Palestinians into 30% of Gaza. That's an open air concentration camp, and a concentration camp where they've destroyed nearly every building. And people mainly live in tents. They're now, in this story, they're bombing the tent cities. They're bombing places of worship. But for me, the worst one was they bombed a desalination plant within the last 24 hours.
Of course they did. Of course they did.
That brings fresh water. It was about to go on. It was about to be launched tomorrow, right before they could get fresh water and a tiny bit of relief. Imagine it's Jews in that concentration camp, and they're about to have fresh, clean water for the first time in a long, long time. There's maggots and worms in the water. They've already destroyed the sewage, and the sewage is leaking into the water. They're about to have clean water for the first time. They bombed the plant so the kids in Gaza cannot have clean water. This is what fascists do. And so the fact that we're financing the fascists and helping them kill those kids and helping them stuff over 2 million people into a concentration camp is beyond heartbreaking. And then anytime you say, can we please not at a bare minimum be neutral and not finance the fascists, we all get called anti-Semites, and the American media pounces on us and says, these are the people that should be destroyed. These are the people that are immoral. Look at them sticking up for little children. How dare these anti-Semites? Don't they know Israel has to murder them for self-defense? They were flying a kite. Of course they had to be murdered. And if you object, you're an anti-Semite and your life should be destroyed. Well, that's a bunch of terrorist thugs inside our country helping those fascists kill those kids and honestly steal money from us to finance their fascism.
Every time you ring the bell below, an angel gets his wings. Totally not true, but it does keep you updated on our live shows.